So, hi everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. And first of all, thanks to our organizer of the speaker series for doing so much work on behalf of this event. But anyways, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Professor Dr. Anton Friedrich Koch, Professor of Philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Heidelberg, Germany. But before I introduce him and his work to you, I would like to thank him for his support of the exchange program between our two universities. The Duquesne-Heidelberg exchange program is now in its second year, and as many of you know, several philosophy PhD students from our department at Duquesne have spent or are currently spending a semester at Heidelberg in the Philosophisches Seminar, and last semester we hosted a wonderful graduate philosophy student from the University of Heidelberg in this way. The exchange works at all levels. At the faculty level, last year, Dr. Marcus Herrmann taught in our department, and this semester, our Dr. Lenay Rodemeyer, I'll say it with a German accent now, she'll demand that when she gets back, I'm sure, is teaching at the University of Heidelberg. Plans are underway for another set of exchanges at the PhD and faculty levels next year. Students interested in going to Heidelberg should meet with our current Duquesne chair of the exchange program, Dr. Daniel Salzar. Also, we have an undergraduate spring breakaway course to Heidelberg generated by one of our graduate PhD students, Peter Libby, who was our first student in the exchange program last year. That breakaway course will happen this coming spring. The highlight of the exchange this year is that Professor Dr. Anton Koch has come to present a paper. And I thank him for coming and look forward to his presentation. I would also like to thank our chair, Professor Ron Polanski, for securing the NEH money to help fund Professor Koch's visit. Dr. Polanski has been tireless in supporting this exchange, and he deserves much of the credit for its ongoing success. So now on to Dr. Anton Koch. He is professor of philosophy at the Philosophisches Seminar at the University of Heidelberg, which in itself says a great deal about him, since Heidelberg is one of the best universities in the world, as well as one of the oldest ones. It was founded in 1386. His department is like the grandfather of so much of our tradition in philosophy here at Duquesne. Many of the great philosophers whose works we teach in our department were themselves professors at the University of Heidelberg. Hegel, Heidegger, Jaspers, to mention only a few. So Dr. Koch stands as a renowned philosopher in this tremendous tradition and institution. Not surprisingly, his published works are central to the ongoing tradition of German philosophy. Dr. Koch's publications concern early modern philosophy and Kant through to Hegel and beyond, but he takes these forward also into an engagement with Anglo-American philosophers such as Wittgenstein, Wilfrid Sellars, and Brandon, and so forth. And correct me if I'm wrong, did you mention Carnap when we were in Heidelberg on the Hauptstrasse? Yes. No. So he writes and teaches a lot on Hegel's logic, and more broadly on the ontology and metaphysics of truth, time, and subjectivity. And as is so admirable about German philosophers, he is also versatile in ancient philosophical ideas and languages. Dr. Koch's publications are too numerous to mention, but here are a few titles of his books. Vernunft und Sinnlichkeit im praktischen Denken, 1980. Subjektivität in Raum und Zeit, 1990. Subjekt und Natur, zur Rolle des Ich Denke bei Descartes und Kant, 2004. Versuch über Wahrheit und Zeit, 2006. Wahrheit, Zeit und Freiheit, and just to translate one of them, Truth, Time, and Freedom, 2006 as well. Professor Dr. Koch has many articles and book chapters and introductions to books, and he has been invited all over the world to give talks and to be a visiting professor in China, South America, as well as many places in Europe and America. So, without further ado, please join me in heartily welcoming Professor Dr. Anton Koch, whose paper is entitled, Why People Like Us Are Metaphysically Necessary.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. Thank you, Jennifer, for the very friendly introduction. And I have to thank the department for the possibility of being here. And it's a pleasure for me to be here. And I'm looking forward for our program to work on in the future so that the exchange will last and be successful as it was up to now. Okay, so why people like us are metaphysically necessary. People like us are that's my thesis, metaphysically necessary, which is not to say that some among us are necessary beings, but rather that no possible world is altogether devoid of embodied subjectivity. This claim I call the subjectivity thesis. Few people seem to believe it. Whenever I try to convince people, they're very skeptical. But in my present talk, I want to make a fresh attempt at proving it. The argument will proceed in two major steps, the first of which relates to what I call epistemic individuation, and the second to what I call ontic individuation. Within the first step, I shall first point to the problematic of epistemic and ontic individuation respectively, then offer a short refutation of Cartesian dualism, and third, in sections 1.3 and 1.4, and you see the parts and sections on the handout that was given to you. In the third, in sections 1.3 and 1.4, I shall sketch a little theory of the a priori presuppositions of singular reference. Then, in the big second step, I shall address the problem of ontic individuation and recommend the subjectivity thesis as the natural and, in fact, the only promising candidate solution. So let's start with 1.1, epistemic individuation and ontic individuation. To individuate a thing epistemically is to pick it out in thought or in speech from among all things in the universe. Theoretically, that may look like an impossible mission, there being about 7 billion people living on Earth presently, not to mention non-human beings, other planets and stars and other times. But if that is the problematic of epistemic individuation, then its practical solution is quite easy, in most cases at least. In most cases that concern us, we individuate things not by purely descriptive, purely conceptual thought contents or expressions, but by mixed contents containing both descriptive and indexical elements, like the brown chair over there in front of me, for example. We can do both. Give general descriptions of things and refer to them indexically by means of expressions like this and here and now, I and you, and so on. And in most cases, we use mixed locutions. Proper names, by the way, do not offer a third alternative of referring to things because their use depends upon acts of baptism in which descriptive and indexical contents are used. For example, if someone says, let's call that steep and snowy mountain right over there in front of us the Matterhorn, or whatever. Indexical expressions typically relate to details in a speaker's perceptual field. But perceptual fields of speakers are parts of the one and common spatio-temporal universe. So this perceptual field of mine is not something private and personal, it's part of the common spatio-temporal universe. This is what makes it possible in principle for a speaker to individuate things epistemically and to individuate things in any region of the spatio-temporal universe. Here we already begin to see that something must be wrong with Cartesian dualism. It would be impossible for me to refer to spatio-temporal items if my subjective perceptual field were not a genuine part of the objective spatio-temporal universe. I'll come back to that point in a moment. The practical solution of the problematic of epistemic individuation thus seems easy. What about ontic individuation? is there some problematic to be solved here as well? Ontic individuation is what makes individual things, their individuality or particularity. Things may be counted, therefore it must be settled where one of them ends and the next one begins. That's what Quine's well-known formula, no entity without identity, comes to. Ontic individuation then is what accounts for things' identity and particularity. Some people think that the ontic individuation of a thing must be its hexeity. That is a non-general, essentially singular property that can be exemplified by at most one particular thing. Personally, I think it is not a good idea, but in fact bad metaphysics, to introduce theoretical entities in philosophy. Physicians may do it, but we must refrain from it, or so I think. But if you do so, then you should at least beware of not launching an infinite regress. If hexeties are introduced as theoretical entities that account for the ontic individuation of things, then what does account for the individuation of hexeties in turn? Second order hexeties, and then third and fourth order hexeties, and so on up. If there's no top to that hierarchy, then the individuation on every level is dangling in the air. So let's better forget about hexeties. But is there any problem of ontic individuation in the first place to which the introduction of hexeties could seem to be a solution? Yes, there is such a problem, although hexeties won't solve it. General determinations of things that we grasp by means of general concepts do not individuate things, or if so, then only contingently. That holds true for epistemic and ontic individuation even-handedly. Take the complex concept of a red 1 meter diameter sphere weighing 100 weight, for example. How many things in the universe do fall under this concept? I do not know. Perhaps many, perhaps just one, or perhaps, and most probably, I guess, none. If just one thing falls under the concept, then we may use the concept to individuate that thing epistemically. But ontic individuation cannot hinge on this contingent fact. If there were 2 red 1 meter diameter spheres weighing 100 weight each, then each of them would be an individual or a particular still. Therefore, the use of concepts qua general descriptive representations presupposes some underlying principle of pre-conceptual multitude and individuality. Concepts won't make for individuality. And of course, we know where to find such a principle. Space and time together are that principle of preconceptual multitude. Kant calls them the general forms of intuition, and Peter Strawson calls them the forms of particularity. Together they are the principle of individuation, says Schopenhauer, the veil of Maya creating the illusion of particular things. Illusion or not, space and time are necessary conditions of ontic individuation for basic particulars. And the individuality or particularity of a given item is one of its basic categorical properties. Thus a property it cannot lose without ceasing to exist. An essential or necessary property. Individuality is not an accident. But if nothing like space or time were there to serve as principles of individuality, and if things had only general determinations instead, to be grasped by means of concepts, then individuality would be an accident, which is to say that there would not be individuality and no particular things in the first place. But now we have to ask, are space and time sufficient as principles or guarantors of ontic individuation? The answer has to be in the negative. For all positions in space and time are completely alike, indiscernible, at least if viewed in isolation, abstracting from things that might occupy them. Spatio-temporal positions differ from each other only in virtue of what happens to be the case there. One such position, let's say, is filled with snow, so it is cold and white. Another position is occupied by fire, so it is red and hot. And that's what makes the difference between both positions, ontically as well as epistemically if we refer to the fire or the snow. But here we run into the danger of going full circle. For being cold, red, white, or hot are general determinations that we grasp by means of concepts. Therefore, they cannot serve to individuate things essentially. For that very reason, we first had to welcome spatio-temporal positions as ontic individuators of things. But now we are about to welcome things as individuators of spatio-temporal positions. Obviously, though, things cannot account for the individuality of positions if positions are to account for the individuality of things in turn. If a person in a swamp cannot pull herself up and out by her own bootstraps or her own hairs, then neither can two persons one another by each other's bootstraps. They need a third person outside the swamp, perhaps a farmer with a tractor and a pulling rope, to get them out of the mess they're in. In like manner, spatio-temporal positions on the one hand and things with their general traits on the other need something else for their ontic individuation, something outside the circle of general traits and spatio-temporal positions, or epistemologically speaking, of concepts and indexicals. This then is the problem of ontic individuation, and it is quite parallel to the problem of epistemic individuation. The latter problem is solved, we saw, at least in practice, by recourses to indexical thinking on the part of the subjects who do the individuating. As when, for example, a person thinks or says, the chair here in front of me fits well with the table over there. This undisputed practical solution to the problem of ontic individuation, of epistemic individuation, points the way to a parallel solution of the problem of ontic individuation. We only have to transpose our appeal to indexical thought contents into an ontological key. That is, we, as theoreticians, have to appeal now to something that corresponds to our indexical thought contents on the part of things in space and time. Obviously, we do talk about them as if they had indexical properties, like the property of being here or the property of being there. We just have to take seriously that manner of speaking and claim that things have, in fact, irreducibly indexical properties. Not only properties picked out indexically, but properties that are themselves indexical properties. But indexical properties are there in the world only relative to thinking and perceiving subjects. They are there as what corresponds to the indexical thoughts of subjects. Therefore, the existence of some subjects somewhere and some place in the universe is a necessary fact. We are not an accident. Sooner or later, here or there, the cosmological evolution, starting with the Big Bang, had to come up with some thinking and perceiving subjects out of logical necessity. This is the subjectivity thesis that I want to argue for in what follows. That was just an anticipation. Now, section 1.2, a short refutation of Cartesian dualism. But first, we need a more profound theoretical understanding of indexical reference. For simplicity's sake, I shall concentrate on spatial indexicals throughout my talk and leave temporal indexicals aside. They need a parallel, but then again somewhat different treatment. Our spatial indexicals, as is often said, and rightly so, add up to a kind of informal egocentric spatial coordinate system whose origin, axes, and units of measurements are defined by each person's own body. The origin, or point 0, is, let's say, the virtual meeting point of the incoming light rays according to the laws of geometrical optics, somewhere behind my forehead. The axes and their directions are defined first by the involuntary gravitational acceleration that presses me down to the surface of the Earth. Second, by the voluntary acceleration I can myself bring about in order to move forward. And third, by the possibility of a bifurcation in my voluntary movement forward, either to the left or to the right-hand side. The units of measurement, finally, are defined by relevant parts of my body, like span or foot or L. Starting from this point of departure, I shall now follow two strands of argument. First, in the present section, I shall give a short refutation of Cartesianism. And then, in the next two sections, 1.3 and 1.4, I shall sketch a little theory of the a priori presuppositions of singular reference and add some remarks on the concepts of truth, discourse, and space. So suppose with Descartes, and with Descartes' meditating subject, that the passing show is just a dream. But of course, the subject can refer to the details of the passing show, even if the show is just a dream, and have afterthoughts about them. For instance, it seems to the subject as if he or she, let's say he because Descartes lends him his own personality, were sitting in a parlor right in front of an oven and looking into the open fire. How does he, the subject, refer to those details dreamingly? Well, more or less like we refer to the details of our environments in our waking experience, namely by means of indexical expressions or thought contents like I, and here, and over there, and perhaps you, if the subject is under the impression that there is another subject there, and so on. So the dreaming subject, just like we in our waking experience, has to use an informal, egocentric coordinate system in order to refer to his dreamt experiences. The coordinate system is an abstract structure that does not help you by itself to refer to anything, but that has to be anchored in a real, concrete frame of reference before it can be put to use. So we are back with the idea of ourselves qua corporeal beings as the concrete frames of reference for defining our personal egocentric spatial coordinate systems. What is of the utmost importance here is the fact that the frame of reference of a given coordinate system has to belong to the same manifold of items that the coordinate system is used to refer to. The frame of reference of a spatial coordinate system, therefore, must stand in spatial relations to the items that can be referred to by the coordinate system, and must have the same basic ontological status as those items. Now, the meditating subject thinks, over there in front of me there's an oven, and interrupts himself thinking, but no, it's not a real oven because I'm just dreaming. Very well. Let us suppose that the oven is there only as a content of the subject's dreaming imagination. But since the subject must himself function as the frame of reference for his indexical thoughts about the details of the passing show, he and those details must in principle have equal ontological status. Either the subject and his objects of reference are just fictions, or both parts are perfectly real. If both parts were fictions, the dreaming subject would himself be a product of his own dreaming imaginative activities, and thus a very strange kind of causa sui. I won't consider this alternative more deeply. For Descartes lets the subject claim at the beginning of the second meditation, as we all know, that he at least is real. Cogito sum. If he is real, though, then the passing show that extends before and around him as a seemingly spatial manifold must be real as well, or else the subject could not even be deceived into believing in such a scenery. The res cogitans therefore is and must be at the same time a res extensa, an embodied corporeal thinking subject. Of course, one may object to this quick refutation of dualism by appealing to situations in which we are in fact dreaming or hallucinating or daydreaming or whatever. Do I, this perfectly real person, really belong to the space of my dream or my daydream, or to the space of the film that I'm presently watching or the novel that I'm reading? The answer is a simple yes. There's only one unitary, all-encompassing and very real space. And that singular space suffices for our dreams and hallucinations, daydreams and fictions as well. For instance, when you sit in a playhouse in Pittsburgh watching, let's say, Romeo and Juliet, then we refill actual space in our imagination with new meanings, new items, new senses. We pretend that the stage in front of us is not part of a building in Pittsburgh any longer, but now a garden in Verona, and that the actors on the stage are no longer Adam Miller and Eve Smith, but now Romeo and Juliet, and the English sentences they utter are now Italian sentences, and so on. As playgoers, thus, we hold constant the one and only egocentrically perceived real space and recast it in thought and imagination with deviant contents. We even go so far, typically, as to cross out ourselves retroactively in thought and imagination. We are not in Verona, so we have to cross ourselves out, but only retroactively, because, of course, we are and remain indispensable as the center of egocentrically represented space. Try to imagine space from the outside, that is, without yourself within it. I think it's impossible. Something like this happens to us not only in theaters, but also in dreams or hallucinations. We invariably hold fixed real space and we fill or recast it in thought and imagination, which is particularly easy when we dream, because then we are asleep and our eyes are closed, so we do not see a thing. And some brain processes that would remain subserviently in the unnoticed background of our waking experience now can press forward to the focus of our attention and create sensory patterns that we, drugged with sleep, mistakenly project further out into space. They are in space, but in a very narrow space, somewhere in our brain. We project them further out. We are thus deceived about the actual place or position of what is going on when we dreamingly mistake some firing of some neurons in our skull for a fire in a house in front of us. But nonetheless, we have to hold constant the one and only real space, even in our dreams and hallucinations, there being no other one. Indexical representation would otherwise not be possible, not even in a dream. This is, by the way, strong evidence for Kant's thesis that our original representation of space is an intuition or imagination a priori. Space is present to us quite independently of any specific sensory input. Whether we are awake or are dreaming or hallucinating, whether we perceive veridically or fall prey to a perceptual illusion, we are always and invariably surrounded by one and the same real space in which we orientate ourselves by representing it egocentrically, irrespective of varying sensory inputs, and in this sense, a priori. My subjectivity thesis, yet to be proved, says the third party that leads out of the circle of general properties and spatio-temporal positions in ontic individuation is subjectivity. If that is true, then our short refutation of dualism shows that the relevant kind of subjectivity must be embodied corporeal subjectivity, or else one could not fix and define an egocentric spatial coordinate system with regard to it. Disembodied immaterial subjectivity would be totally idle and contribute nothing to a solution of the problems of epistemic and ontic individuation. But the idea of immaterial subjectivity is altogether out of place anyway, I think. Subjectivity is conceptually correlated to objectivity. Subjects raise objective truth claims, claims to objective truth. This basic practice of raising truth claims is the source and locus of all our knowledge a priori. We know a priori whatever we must know in order to take part in that practice, which pragmatists like Sellers and Robert Brandom call the game of giving and asking for reasons. Karl Leonhard Reinhold, an early Kantian philosopher, once called it the fact of consciousness. I just call it the fact of truth. In objective truth claims, we are fallible. Our fallibility is what makes for their objectivity, their partial independence of our beliefs. Therefore, objective truth claims have to be raised by way of thought contents that are alethically bivalent. They ought to be true, but they may be false. That is, they are true or false. Contents that are bivalent in this way have to be discursive or propositional contents. And in the most elementary cases, just simple subject-predicate contents. In this way, subjectivity is conceptually correlated with predication. So that's the important thing. Subjectivity is conceptually related with predication, with a duality of general determinations and individual items. Consequently, subjects must be conceived as being able to refer to individual things in space and time. Therefore, they must be spatio-temporal and thus corporeal themselves. We cannot make good sense of any other form of subjectivity. Now, section or part 1.1, our original self-orientation a priori. The quick refutation of dualism points the way to our next topic, self-orientation a priori in space. The problematic of epistemic individuation was, how can we safely individuate things given that there are so many of them around us in the universe? The beginning of an answer was, we can do so by means of our egocentric spatial coordinate systems, which make possible our uses of indexical expressions. My own body marks the region of origin of the coordinate system here within the boundaries of my body. That's the marking of that region of origin. And more precisely, the point of origin here somewhere behind my eyes, where the incoming light rays would meet according to geometrical optics. Next, my body, by its essential asymmetries, marks the axis and their directions, up and down, left and right, back and front. Last but not least, various aspects of my body define some basic units for measuring distances, as I said, like span, foot, and L. By means of an egocentric coordinate system like that, I can then individuate epistemically every point and every region in the universe. But then, how do we individuate epistemically the frame of reference underlying the egocentric coordinate system? That is, our own respective bodies. The simple answer would be by means of the egocentric coordinate system. Yes, that's true, of course, but it cannot be the whole truth of the matter. Take, for instance, a standard three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system. Its origin can trivially be specified by the triple of coordinates 0/0/0. In a similar way, I can trivially be specified as the person who is presently here. From within the system, the specifying of the coordinates of its origin is a breeze, easier than stealing candy from a baby. What is not so easy, however, is the primary introduction of the coordinate system in the first place. For then, one has to specify its origin independently of the system, without its help. A coordinate system must be anchored originally in a frame of reference. That frame of reference then must be specified, that is, individuated epistemically by some other means. In the case of our informal egocentric coordinate system, then, we must have recourse to something else besides empirical concepts and indexicals in order to anchor the system in a suitable frame of reference, namely in ourselves qua embodied subjects. The egocentric coordinate system must, in other words, be anchored pre-conceptually and pre-indexically by means of some knowledge that could therefore be rightly called a priori. This requirement, just laid bare in little transcendental argument, is met phenomenally by way of our a priori self-knowledge. By way of our a priori self-knowledge. Okay. Each of us knows a priori that he or she is here presently as a necessarily asymmetrical corporeal thinking and perceiving subject. This knowledge to be spelled out further in the theory of the a priori presuppositions of reference to individual things in space and time is what I call our original self-localization a priori. This self-localization has to be argued for by way of transcendental argument of the type I just tried to give an argument. And then it has to be confirmed phenomenally by relating it to some well-known phenomenon. And I think we have to relate it to the well-known Cartesian insight or evidence brought out in Descartes' famous formula cogito sum. What is important here is not to give a Cartesian interpretation of the Cartesian insight, though. The cogito must be interpreted against Descartes as the original self-knowledge not of a Cartesian res cogitans, of some purely formal, immaterial, worldless subject, but as the original self-identification and self-localization of a three-dimensional, asymmetric, corporeal person who knows a priori that he or she is a three-dimensional, asymmetric, corporeal person. It is an ingredient of this knowledge, a priori, that we know that we are suited as frames of reference for egocentric spatial coordinate systems, which then have to be established, of course, using empirical information as well. So the relevant a priori here is not pure in Kant's strict sense, but saturated empirically. It does therefore belong not to transcendental philosophy in the strict Kantian sense, which is pure, but rather to metaphysics, which may be related to empirical determinations. But this is only an aside. I think, by the way, phenomenally, I'm quite close to Merleau-Ponty here, but he doesn't give a transcendental argument for this point. So I try to have it both ways. First, give a transcendental argument for subjectivity, which must necessarily be corporeal, three-dimensional, asymmetric, and then point to a phenomenon which fulfills the transcendental argument, and the phenomenon would be the Cartesian insight, the Cartesian evidence, interpreted in an un-Cartesian way. Now, 1.4, truth, discourse, and space. Human subjectivity is entangled with our a priori knowledge that we are corporeal, asymmetrical, three-dimensional beings. The pre-empirical conceptual resources that we have to retrieve in this knowledge come from our basic understanding of the concept of truth. Truth has three essential aspects. First, a realistic or objective one, then a pragmatic or normative one, and third, an epistemic or phenomenal one. Under the guidance of the realistic aspect, truth appears as some correspondence or other of thought and world. Under the guidance of the pragmatic aspect, truth appears as assertability warranted by certain techniques of justification or verification, or by coherence, consensus, under certain norms, or what have you. Under the guidance of the phenomenal aspect, finally, truth appears as aletheia, famously translated by Heidegger as Unverborgenheit, that is, the unconcealment of things. Of course, I cannot enter into the far-reaching ramifications of the theory of truth on the present occasion. Suffice it to state then quite dogmatically that to the aspects of truth there correspond three essential aspects, or more specifically, three logical proto-dimensions of discourse, which were traditionally lumped together under the headings of concept, judgment, and inference. Particulars fall under framework concepts in the logical dimension of discursive height or altitude. A subject term is combined with a predicate term under the norm of what is right to form a judgment. This defines the logical dimension of discursive width or latitude. Thirdly, we move forward from premises to conclusions in the logical dimension of discursive depth or length, or whatever you want to call it. Thus, discourse, as language itself, is structured three-dimensionally by its conceptual, its propositional, and its inferential aspect. That is, by a logical up and down, a logical right and wrong, and a logical back and forth. Given these basic a priori resources, we then can begin to structure physical space in thought as well, given, that is, the logical proto-dimensions on the one hand, and our original a priori self-localization on the other. Connecting the logical proto-dimensions with our asymmetric corporeal subjectivity in thought, we get the axes and directions of our egocentric spatial coordinate system. Space and discourse, the form of particularity and the form of generality, are correlative, and, so to speak, made for each other. And now I come to the final second part, short second part, the subjectivity thesis as the solution of the problem of ontic individuation. Finally, let's get back to the problem of ontic individuation. What is there to guarantee the individuality of individual things? The question may sound nonsensical and superfluous, as if the individuality of individual things could somehow be endangered. Well, in a way, it is in fact endangered, and that is what gives the problem of ontic individuation its particular bite. It is endangered by the threat of circularity in the individuation of things and positions. The threat or danger has to do with the logical principle of the identity of indiscernibles, which says that if everything that is true of X is also true of Y, then X is identical with Y. This principle is a theorem of second-order predicate logic. In second-order predicate logic, therefore, identity need not be introduced as a primitive predicate like in first-order logic. Rather, we may instead use the principle of identity of indiscernibles to define identity. As a logically valid sentence, then, whether we view it as a theorem or as a definition, the identity of indiscernibles is not disputed and not negotiable. What is negotiable are its differing interpretations. Leibniz gave a narrow interpretation, considering only the intrinsic properties of things. If all intrinsic properties of X are as well intrinsic properties of Y, then, according to Leibniz, X is identical with Y. This interpretation seems to be too narrow, though. Why shouldn't it be possible for two intrinsically alike billiard balls, let's say, to exist, with one of them presently lying on a billiard table and the other lying on the floor? In order not to rule out this prima facie possibility from the outset, we'd better let the predicate variable in the formulation of the identity of indiscernibles range over extrinsic or relational properties like lying on a table as well. What is important about the identity of indiscernibles is the following message. There can be no absolute, magical, completely groundless difference between two things. If X and Y are two numerically distinct entities, then they must differ in some intrinsic or extrinsic determination. There cannot be a magical, inexplicable two-ness or three-ness or plurality in the world. If we were to accept absolute, groundless, magical non-identity, we would maneuver ourselves into the absurd position that we could, as a matter of principle, never know whether the moon, let us say, or what looks to us to be the moon, was not in fact 17 or 243 indiscernible moons. If we, in order to avoid this predicament, add the postulate that there could at most be one thing of a given kind at a place and a time, so it must be one moon only because that place and time can be filled only by one moon, then the predicament would come back as a challenge to make sure that what appeared to us as one place was not in fact a plurality of 17 or 243 indiscernible places. In short, the identity of indiscernibles interpreted liberally is not negotiable. How liberally exactly it has to be interpreted, we must now try to find out. My answer will be this one. We have to bring into account relational properties, yes, but this by itself will not suffice to get out of the predicament. We need as well relational properties of a very specific kind, namely indexical properties, that is, properties that exist if and only if embodied subjectivity exists. This, of course, is the subjectivity thesis again, and now we have come close to see why it is justified. We have to attend to a certain tension between, on the one hand, the identity of indiscernibles, and on the other hand, the fact of truth, the game of reasons, the fact of discourse. In discursive thinking, we conceive of general properties under which particular items may fall. Correlated with this epistemological situation, we find as an ontological matter of fact the existence of space and time as principles of preconceptual multitude. General properties, be they intrinsic or relational, do not suffice for the ontic individuation of things, or if so, then only contingently. Therefore, it is possible that there might be two numerically distinct things that fall under the same concepts, including relational concepts. To this possibility, there corresponds the ostensible fact, it's not a real fact, that space and time, qua principles of preconceptual multitude, individuate things by sheer magic. It looks as if space and time individuated things by sheer magic. Of course, we already know the circle threatening behind the ostensible fact. Taken by themselves, space-time positions are indiscernible and thus do violate the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. Absolute space, absolute time, and absolute space-time, for that matter, thus are logically impossible. They are possible only together with something that fills them, some real things and events. But even then, ontic individuation is not yet secured, as witness the possibility of symmetrical or infinitely repetitive fillings of space and time. Max Black, for example, once coined the idea of a world consisting of just two qualitatively identical spheres. These spheres would be strictly indiscernible and thus violate the logical principle of the identity of indiscernibles. Okay, now finally we're in for the decisive point. Individuality is a categorical, necessary property of individual things. We thus need a principle of ontic individuation that works for all possible worlds. Now, epistemic individuation works as far as it does because embodied subjects are capable of an a priori self-localization in space and time, which makes possible indexical thought contents. To indexical thought contents, there correspond, on the part of the things referred to, by means of those contents, indexical properties like being here or being over there, 3 yards from me, and so on. Epistemic individuation thus would suffice for ontic individuation. But it occurs only in worlds inhabited by embodied subjects. Since ontic individuation must be guaranteed in all spatial-temporal worlds, we have to conclude that all worlds, all spatial-temporal worlds, are inhabited by embodied subjectivity. That is, that embodied subjectivity is metaphysically necessary. It is an undeniable fact that embodied subjectivity actually exists. No possible future science could ever find out that this was not so. to deny the existence of subjectivity would be pragmatically inconsistent. All we need do is transpose this undeniable fact into the modality of necessity, and the solution of the problematic of ontic individuation will be perfect. All things in the spatio-temporal universe, present, past, or future, have indexical properties relative to me here now. And this already guarantees their ontic individuation according to the requirements of the identity of indiscernibles. Nothing else besides embodied subjectivity is putting itself forward for doing the job. So I conclude that the subjectivity thesis has been established. The thesis says two things. First, subjectivity is metaphysically necessary. Second, necessarily subjectivity is corporeal and asymmetric and knows a priori that this is so. We can accentuate or strengthen the thesis still a bit. Necessarily, all particular things are spatio-temporally related to corporeal, finite, intramundane subjectivity, which means that they coexist with finite cognitive perspectives onto them in their world. If they existed as well for a possible or actual infinite cognitive perspective, their individuation would be lost. If a God's eye view, or a view from nowhere on particular things, were as much as possible, then the indexical properties of things would in principle be reducible to absolute non-indexical properties. This, however, would reenact the antinomy of non-identical spatio-temporal indiscernibles, and thus give away our solution of the problem of ontic individuation. Omniscience with regard to things in space and time is not only technically impossible or hard to achieve, but metaphysically and yes, logically impossible in the strictest sense. For Plato, being and cognizability match completely. What is perfectly real, the forms, is at the same time perfectly knowable, he claims. I call this the ideal of transparency. It has dominated the history of metaphysics, first in theological and nowadays in physicalistic guises. What is the case and what exists according to this ideal can in principle be known through and through, be it by an omniscient God or be it by an idealized superphysicist of the future. However, the subjectivity thesis entails that the ideal of transparency is not only unattainable, but also intrinsically incoherent. Existence goes together with cognizability, yes, but always with partial cognizability only. This is no human defect, but the way of being. Thank you very much for your attention.